Honestly, it is helpful that in the middle of all these annexation threats from the US and this rush to figure out what the Canadian identity is right now, the CRTC is literally having hearings about what gets to count as Canadian content. It's a big question. It's the right time to ask it. The group chat is here. Let's go. I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion. Okay, I think it's safe to say that you've heard of Canadian content, right? Like, it's broadcasters in this country have to make room for a certain amount of Canadian content, and there are rules in place that govern that. Those rules, though, can sometimes end up producing some quirky results, like not all of Drake's music, or Celine Dion's music for that matter, counts as Canadian content, but Lenny Kravitz's cover of American Woman, that one does count as Canadian content. The TV adaptation of The Handmaid's Tale, based on a Margaret Atwood book, shot in Canada, not Canadian content. The CanCon rules are not new. The world of entertainment has changed a lot, though, since they were put in place, and it has raised some questions. The big question is this one. Why do all the big broadcasters in this country, we're talking about like Rogers, Bell, but also CBC, like pay 30% of their revenue into a fund to create Canadian content, and then streamers like Netflix don't really have to do that? Jesse Wente's here, Vass Bednar is here, and Anthony Q. Farrell is here. Hello to all of you. Welcome to the show.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm delighted to be resolving just a small matter. What gets to count as Canadian content with this illustrious panel? Look, Vass, I'm going to start with you on this. The CRTC just wrapped up these hearings. It took about 2 weeks of hearings. I mentioned the CanCon rules. You know, it's sort of like it's CanCon is like shorthand for all these rules to sort of govern what gets to count as Canadian content. When you look at this right now, what's wrong with the rules that currently exist? Like, why did we even need to look at them in the first place?
Well, the reason we needed to look is to kind of play a game of catch up, right? So, yes, we've always had debates simmering around the composition and definitions and kind of scorecards that you mentioned. But the broadcasters that you mentioned are licensed under the Broadcasting Act. And there's kind of, through public policy, a bit of a social contract there in terms of the duty to kind of reinvest in Canadian productions and, you know, help others create content in Canada. And the digital streamers kind of accelerated at a time that they weren't brought into this regime. So the big question is, do we pull them into the regime that we have? Do we move forward with a new regime, or do we carve out and create exceptions for the digital giants? And that's kind of what the fight's all about.
Oh, just a small matter.
No big deal.
No big deal at all. Anthony, you're a writer, you're a showrunner, and you're speaking at these hearings. Just from your perspective, why do the rules need to be updated right now?
You look at the industry, it's changed a little bit since 1982. Just a smidge here and there. I'm also a member of the Writers Guild of America. We've been on strike 3 times since we changed this act because of how fast moving this industry is. So it's important that we update it for where we are right now and hopefully look towards where we're going, so that 43 years from now, when we update it again, we won't have as much work to do. So I think it's just a matter of like the business is not what it was in '82. Like I can't find any more of my VHS tapes. I have some, but I don't know. I got my wedding on a VHS tape, I think. I don't know what else I got.
First of all, 43 years sounds like a mighty long time in terms of just like updating, especially for an industry that moves this fast. But also, I think like there's this like wider context, Jesse, of like, I always turn into you for context here, you know, in terms of these questions. But like, what is the point of having CanCon rules in the first place? Because I think that's something that maybe people don't necessarily spend a lot of time thinking about.
Well, I mean, the point is to have Canadian culture. I think is the determination that we want that might be something that is good to have for ourselves, and an admission that if we don't fund it, if we don't actively engage in allowing it to be made, we won't have it, in large part because we live next to the single largest content creator in the history of the planet, who have industrialized this like they industrialize all industries to the point where no one can compete with the sheer volume and the mass of their storytelling sector. And so if you look at the history of Canada, like it comes in waves. Like there's right after the post-Second World War, we sort of found a lot of institutions. Also in the 30s, you have like the NFB and the CBC sort of become a thing. And that was the first wave of like, we need Canadian culture, so let's have institutions. And then in the 70s and in the 80s, you have these content regulations that are now, well, we have these institutions, but we need artists to actually be able to fulfill them. And so now we're going to require that we have, you know, certainly when it comes to broadcast licensings and what the CRTC oversees, is if you're going to exist and take advantage of the airspace, quite literally, then you also have to contribute to the growth of Canadian culture. And this is how we've done it.
The history of Canadian content is not exactly like rosy, right? Like there is, I think like we sort of have inherited the system, but we maybe believe it to be like, oh, we are all in agreement that this is the thing that we need to do, you know. But like Pierre Junot, the Junos are named after him. He was like, you know, he was a person who introduced the Canadian content system, for example, for music, and just not like broadcasters were like, yeah, that's fine. We'll make sure we play 30% Canadian music. Broadcasters actually fought that for a little while. It just that it ended up being a kind of a hard system to undo in the end. Jesse, can you talk about whether Canadian content as a protectionist system, as a system that says we're going to preserve this amount of space to remind us of who we are, do you see that as one of our successes? Like, has it actually kind of worked out okay?
I mean, up until recently, I would say overwhelmingly yes. You know, look at the fact that we have a Canadian music industry and we have Canadian music stars. Like we don't get the Tragically Hip without Canadian content regulations. Like if you just look at that particular band, they were huge in Canada and until the end played relatively small venues in America. That's entirely because they were awesome, but also because we had Canadian content regulations that meant the big rock stations were looking for Canadian rock acts to play, and there you have it. Yeah. So I think on music and for some time on TV and movies, I think it's been very effective, and I think I think it has worked, and we should recognize that it's worked, and but also recognize that these things need to be updated. And to your point, Elamin, you know, private broadcasters, those that have existed sort of to make money off Canadian content, have fought against these regulations forever. Like that has been their stance to this day, whether they are owned and operated in Canada or outside of Canada. Like the private broadcasters have always resisted this because of the perception that Canadian cultural acts or artists do not actually meet the market demands.
Yeah, I don't want like anyone to get the impression that like private broadcasters were like, we want to play this much Tragically Hip. Like at first they were like, you know, like we'd rather keep playing AC/DC, but it's just a matter of actually being able to create space for things that are made in this country. Vass, I want to give people some context here, so I just want to share a bit of this context here. If we look at the current rules, large English language broadcasters have to contribute 30% of their revenue. It's a pretty significant chunk back into Canadian broadcasting programming. Last year, the CRTC ordered that streaming services like Netflix, like Disney, like Amazon, they have to pay 5% of their annual Canadian revenues to a fund to make Canadian content, like right here. So it's definitely not an even playing field by any stretch. The big streamers canceled their appearances at this hearing. Instead, an umbrella group showed up called Motion Picture Association Canada, spoke on their behalf. They're arguing that streamers shouldn't be expected to sort of fulfill the same responsibilities as the large broadcasters. Can you just summarize their position for us? Why? What are they saying?
Sure. I mean, look, if this is a conversation about power and independence, and as Jesse was saying, private interests and the public interest not always being matched up. What this group is saying and arguing as an umbrella organization is that, you know, they're sort of saying, hold the phone. We do invest in Canadian cultural productions on our own terms. We've been creating jobs through the investments we make. So they're exhibiting a preference for, we do want to deploy dollars into the Canadian broader ecosystem, but we want to do it kind of on our terms, at our discretion. And we don't want to be compelled to kind of, you know, come into the system. There's also an element of kind of the algorithmic control, right? The discoverability. So it's not just what's made, but what people can find and how they find it. So that's going to be a future hearing at the CRTC. There's actually some more kind of really incredible hearings coming up. But back to the Motion Picture Association, they're also saying, yeah, you know, we're global. We're digital. This is just so different than kind of what you're used to that we shouldn't be kind of brought into the system. But I really think you do have to look at the message that's being sent by not even indulging our parliamentary processes and attending the hearings and what that says. And, you know, we're in a different cultural moment. And if we're not ready as Canadians, forget redefining CanCon. It's really tough. And I was like kind of scared when you started talking about it that you would come to me first. I was like, oh no. If we don't assert and reassert our digital cultural sovereignty, then we're just going to barely be renting space on other people's platforms and not even making stuff. Like, no, really. Really?
Okay, Q, I want to get you in on this in just a moment, but just to give people maybe an example to wrap your head around. You go to Disney Plus, which is the broadcaster.
That's where you go all the time.
Where I go all the time, but also like they carry Shogun, right? Shogun wins a historic amount of Emmys. That show is shot in this country. It's shot here in Canada. The streamer position, if I understand it correctly, is saying like we'll invest in your industry on our own terms, which is to say we'll shoot our shows here, but we won't necessarily make a show that is specifically Canadian, or that money will necessarily have to stay in Canada. What's on the line if these big streamers don't buy into the same level that the broadcasters are buying? Like in terms of just like if they don't pay an equal share, what's on the line here?
Higher barriers to entry for artists and creators, little to no investment in the next generation of content creators, a loss of voices and diversity and perspectives and richness. It's not just paying into the system. It's also, again, about control. You use the word protectionist, and that's tough, I think, because it sounds so defensive, like we're always kind of pushing others away. And I do think it's more about being assertive and recognizing that there's a role for the state to make these markets more free and fair and tailor them in a way that works for Canada and is aligned with our values and what we care about and what we care about for future generations. So a lot is at stake, but it's going to be kind of dressed up and dressed out. It's going to be framed like past hearings were, which is, oh, the government's slow and clunky and doesn't understand this wonderful digital stuff. So I'm sorry, that's why I also come back to the element of control and our algorithmic kind of sovereignty in our everyday lives, because I can't program my discoverability. I can't say on Netflix or on YouTube, I'd like to see either a certain proportion of Canadian content or show me more films made by women. You're always dependent on their categorizations and kind of what they're surfacing. So it really is about us versus digital forces and kind of a data-driven context where we're losing power, not just as Canadians, but we're losing power as consumers too, right? So this is the production element, but in terms of our ability to choose what we enjoy and what we support with our time and attention and our money, that's at risk too.
Yeah, I hear you when you say that's a reaction to the idea of the word protectionist, right? It sort of scans as that way, scans as defensive. But I'm not sure that it is. I think sometimes it can be quite an assertive position to say, no, like we deserve some space here. How much space that is, that's sort of up to us to sort of argue about. Q, let me ask you this. The streamers already have so much power here. What does their stance in this position, the stance that Vass just outlined, what does their stance tell you right now?
Pardon the cuss, but that's malarkey.
That's not a cuss, but...
malarkey, sir.
Okay.
That's a Canadian term.
Here's the thing. Let me just take a sip of my maple syrup here real quick.
All right.
So here's the thing, right? The streamers are not here in Canada because they want to make Canada a better place. They're here because we're convenient. They're here because we're good at what we do. They're here because we are right beside America, like Jess was saying, they are the biggest exporter of content. We understand them. We can make shows similar to them. We can do a lot of those things for less of a price tag, right? They're here because we're good for them. So for them to say we're already putting money into the system, you're doing that because it's helpful to you. What you should be doing is you've got to play like everyone else. And I'm saying I have Disney Plus, I have Netflix as a TV writer. I also have cable. So my Rogers subscription, money goes back into the system. Yeah. My Netflix subscription, no money goes back into the system. And if people are cutting Canadian cable and just going to American streamers, how are we going to protect Canadian artists to make future shows? And if they're saying, well, we're already given a bunch of, we're giving all the key grips and we're giving all the service production people money, cool, but how are we going to be able to make more Canadian content unless we're actually filling back up those coffers, right? So what they're asking for is not a lot, considering I think they were suggesting 5%, where other Canadian broadcasters are having to give 30%.
Yeah,
that's not a lot. You're already making money. It's not like we're taking money you don't have. It's based on your revenue, right? So I personally think I understand the fight because these big corporations are always going to be trying to figure out ways to keep their profits as high as possible. So I understand the fight and I understand where they're coming from, but I also feel like I hope the CRTC is seeing all this and you know, we'll get a ruling hopefully, you know, in the next year or so, and then we'll get, you know, we'll be able to build our business back up because it has been a struggle with the Canadian industry over the last few years, especially. So it'll be good to be able to get people working again.
I can't believe that this is a story that makes Q cuss on the radio and say the word malarkey. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This is Commotion. Vass Bednar is here. Anthony Q. Farrell is here. Jesse Wente's here. And we're talking about CanCon rules, and they're about to change. So how could that affect you as a listener? I think that's really important to sort of highlight here. Jesse, right now, a show or a movie qualifies as CanCon based on who makes it and where it's made. That's interesting to me because we're sitting a couple days after The Apprentice, the Donald Trump movie, won Best Picture at the Canadian Screen Awards. Famously, Donald Trump, not Canadian, but very few of the cast are. You know, you have someone like Jeremy Strong, you have someone like Sebastian Stan. That's a movie. Daniel Berkman, Canadian producer. That movie is made in conjunction with a Canadian production company, so it becomes a Canadian picture. One of the suggestions floated was that to qualify as CanCon, a show would have to look and feel distinctly Canadian. I don't know what that means. What are the pros and cons of expanding the definition to consider the Canadianness of a story here? And maybe help us out with like maybe an example that is like a show that is technically CanCon, but doesn't maybe feel like it. What comes to mind for you?
Boy, I'll have to think about that last part for a second, Elamin. But in terms of adding sort of Canadianness, I, like you, would struggle to understand what exactly that is. I mean, beyond like Anne of Green Gables as maybe the most persistent sort of Canadianness myth sort of thing, storytelling. Like beyond that, I don't know what else that would be other than, you know, I flash back to Score, the hockey musical, as like, you know, like infusing that sort of thing. My approach to this has always been, I care much less about the what is being made and like the storytelling, and I care much more about the who. And I come from this, you know, as you know, Elamin, and the audience does, you know, for years I've been advocating for Indigenous people to have space, and it wasn't so that they could tell a specific story. That wasn't the point, because I don't know what stories Indigenous storytellers are going to want to tell, and I want them to have freedom. This is the point: the freedom to tell whatever that looks like for them. But for that to be considered. And so for me, I think, you know, to your point, we've always, the way the point system has worked for, at least for, and this is true actually in music too, they would classify above the line talent. And so for folks, what that means is the folks who make the creative decisions, basically, the producer, the writer, the songwriter, the artist. It matters less where, although in music it does very much matter where it was recorded, but it doesn't so much matter for that on film and TV. So we've famously made American movies like X-Men movies and all of this stuff in Canada for decades and decades. And to the point, I think this always gets back to what do Canadians want? Because the choice point is ultimately, you could just become a service sector for America, which is what they do with like China when it comes to their manufacturing, right? They outsource all the making of the thing to a different country, but all the money returns to America. And we have that, like we already have a significant amount of the sector that already does that, we call service productions to the US. But what you don't necessarily get out of that is our own stories. And that's ultimately what we're asking for. In terms of a show that might seem Canadian, that I'm struggling to think of one that would seem Canadian, and isn't, because that's usually not the way. Is usually the reverse.
The other way around
is how to make Canada look like. The one I always laugh at, and I remember reviewing this on the air, was the Jackie Chan movie Rumble in the Bronx, which I said is a lot more like Rumble in Stanley Park. The entire thing is shot in Vancouver, and that's mostly been the story of those cross-border projects.
Yeah,
I kind of like this too, though, because this is a moment for discoverability of our own, understanding that system, right? It's an imperfect system, oft criticized, but when you do sit down and look at it, it has some flexibility built in, right? The scorecard, the kind of 6 out of 10. It's like you're an undergrad, right? If you get a C, you're good. Move on. You're C. It's Canadian
enough. Yeah.
But what an opportunity for us to sort of help people understand how that system is right now, because there's a lot of delight I'm having in hearing about the Jackie Chan film or understanding some of those differences and also what we value. We're talking about people a lot of the time now, right? People, jobs, their creativity. What else is at stake? Do you want to consume culture in the future that is computationally generated? Do you want systems to be trained on what we watch and consume? Do you want to see a human actor or a computer actor? Do you want to hear a human voice or a computer voice? Do you want to see a Canadian landscape or a digital background? I worry that I am sounding like a weird Cassandra or Vassandra. Yeah. But like these are the conversations that have been more sophisticated in the US in one of your many guilds, Anthony, than we've had here in Canada. And that's what we need to stand up against and protect our cultural future in Canada.
2 things. One, Cassandra dies in that story, so I don't wish that for you for telling the truth.
Spoiler.
I'm just to put that on the table. That's one, and then number 2, Anthony. What comes to mind for me as I hear all this is that again at the Canadian Screen Awards, the TV show that won Best Drama was in fact Law and Order Toronto, right? Which is an interesting question, is to say, hey, does this look and feel Canadian because it's a format that was perfected and developed in the United States, and then we've adapted it to some of our headlines that we're dealing with here. So what do you make of that idea that a story should somehow feel distinctly Canadian? What does that mean to you?
So I was actually a part of the workshops the CRTC was holding when they were talking about what's Canadian content. So I've been having this conversation for feels like a year now, even before that actually, but officially for a year. And all I have to say is like just kind of like what Jesse said. Like, who is making it is what's important to me. If a Canadian is creating it and behind is the creative force of the series, is producing the series, I think it's Canadian. To tell someone in Halifax that what you're doing is specifically Canadian, but what someone in Burnaby is doing is, well, it's different than what's going on in Halifax, so that can't be Canadian too. Canada is so diverse. There are so many things that are Canadian. To try and define, you would need a book even bigger than any dictionary to define what Canada is, right? Because there are so many people, and it's growing. Anytime new people come here, you are Canadian. Your voice is now Canadian. So it's about where the stories are coming from, who's telling these stories. If you're Canadian, that's Canadian content. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with it. It's hard to define it any other way. And also, I'll just point out for a lot of people, when you say something looks Canadian, that doesn't always mean a positive thing.
They don't mean it as a compliment.
So, yes. It can be a stereotype.
Exactly. So,
yeah.
So it's one of those things where it's like, why would you I don't think we need to define that part of it. But I think, if a show looks like sort of, awesome, great. If a show looks like Popularity Papers, awesome, great. Those are both Canadian shows. They're trying to reach different audiences. Their visual aesthetic is tied to the type of show that it is. Both Canadian, both great. I don't think I think trying to define that is we're just going to be talking in circles like I kind of am right now.
What I appreciate with that framing is that it's a framing at the end of the day tethered to sovereignty, right? Because it's not about, it's not about the maple syrupness of the story. It's not about it being Score, the hockey musical. It's about being like, did a Canadian, make the decision to tell the story? And when we're talking about a certain level of creative decisions that went into it, which is to say, like, maybe that's the argument for why The Apprentice, the Donald Trump movie, can be counted as a Canadian film because we had a producer who's a Canadian producer who made the creative decisions made some of the creative decisions that are involved in this story. I want to keep having this conversation with you guys, but we just got to say goodbye to our radio audience right now, and then we'll keep going for our YouTube audiences and the podcast audiences. But if you're listening on the radio, there's going to be a bit more of this conversation. I've been hanging out with Jesse Wente and Vass Bednar and Anthony Q. Farrell. We're going to keep chatting. Find the rest of this conversation wherever you get your podcasts, or also on YouTube, because there's just so much more to this idea of what gets to count as Canadian identity and Canadian content. Pick it up in just a moment. Okay, for me. It's not too much of a leap. If it's not too much of a leap, this reminds me a little bit of the conversations that Sweden is trying to have right now. So Sweden's sort of going through this idea of like, hey, what gets to count as Swedish culture? I don't know what that is, and I don't get to define it. I go like IKEA ? But do you think this current geopolitical moment, we sort of think about all the pressures that we're under from Donald Trump, the 51st state rhetoric, do you think that requires us to sort of like have a similar national conversation in this country?
I think that could be very productive. It'd be very muddled. It'd be very messy, but it could be the right moment. I mean, we also have government to help facilitate tough conversations. Earlier when Anthony was mentioning, it's about people and putting people first. When we regulate products, sorry, don't fall asleep, but I'm here with you. The Competition Bureau, we do have rules around like made in Canada, product of Canada. And there's been a lot of discoverability and discovery rather, where people are kind of into understanding those nuances. And maybe moving forward, there's an opportunity to introduce more of a tiered system or something that is a standard we want to hold, in higher regard, to say that it has a particular level on the scorecard, or that, again, from a people first perspective. I don't have a way to define that, but if we want to kind of recalibrate the system, if we're truly hearing from Canadians that it seems kind of frumpy or outdated, or from industry that it's not working as well as it could be, or that people are kind of exploiting its loopholes and we're losing something, then yes, that could be part of a conversation. We do have a prime minister who wrote a book called Values about values-based governance. I find myself, flipping through it quite a bit, kind of looking for clues and waiting for this government to actually assert more of a vision around what does that mean beyond some of these initial trade conversations that are more kind of concrete and immediate.
Yeah, on the one hand, I thought they'd be sort of more explicit about that. On the other hand, it's been 5 minutes, right? So maybe it'll...
Yes.
Yeah. So
no, I'm with you.
That might still
I'm still in my optimistic phase, and I'm willing for it to go all summer.
That's right. Very, very generous of you. Jesse, it's not lost on me, but just to take it back sort of like what we were saying at the start, is that if this conversation was happening a year ago, right? The CRTC hearings would be covered by some people. We would be covering it on the show. We'd be interested in this conversation. But it wouldn't have implications, I don't think, for the national identity. Or at least, I don't think people would be necessarily framing it in that way. But since the anxiety that has kind of like entered the national consciousness about like what is Canadian and how do we protect what is Canadian, suddenly these hearings and these conversations seem to have, anyway, much higher, even maybe existential kind of stakes. How often do you think we engage with this question of like, hey, who are we as a nation? Do you think that question is like relatively awake in us often? Or is this moment, an invitation to go, boy, have we been sleeping, asleep at the wheel for a little while?
Well, perhaps not surprisingly, I'll probably say the latter. I think it's mostly... And not to say for everyone, but like I think in general, Canadians have been sort of satisfied with the national story and identity for a while. And there's been moments where some of us have been trying to unsettle that comfortableness to try to move that identity a bit. I think it's really for folks like me, and I think the rest of the panel, like I'm so thrilled that we can have this conversation, because it does seem like some of us are engaged in it on an ongoing basis, but not on a mass scale where you actually have radio shows and people actually interested in things like CRTC hearings. And I think, to me, it actually touches on one of the things that goes unsaid, even as we've had this conversation, but is maybe easier to understand, again, from someone who advocates for voices that are not in the mainstream to be in the mainstream, which is I advocate for that because I think there is value and they have a perspective that does not exist in that space. And what I would say to Canadians is, do you think Canadians have a perspective that is valuable and distinct and useful? Then if you do, if anyone who hears that is nodding, then you want Canadian content. Like we need to foster that. Otherwise, I agree entirely with Vass. Like I think, and maybe again, this comes from my perspective, when you have folks that are willing to erode your culture, you have folks that are willing to erode your borders and your sovereignty. Like that is just how this works. And for Canadians, it may be the first time they're confronting this from a different perspective, but this is how this works, right? They come for your language and they come for your culture, and they will tell you that it's all good. They will even tell you you get to keep it. But that is not how this will work, right? Yeah. And so you have to defend it, and you have to ask your leaders to defend it. I'm a big believer that one of maybe the most important roles of government is to protect us, the people, particularly against forces that are beyond us, that they can deal with. So the protectionist is for us, the humans that live here, and they should be protecting us more from industry than they have. And this is one area where we don't know. We can't quantify the value of the data that these companies are taking out of Canada. I would like the government to try to value that and try to retrieve some of that, like they would if these folks came for the oil or the forests. We have very big regulations around how we monitor those things and what foreign companies can do. Like our existence and activity on these platforms, to me, is as valuable as those natural resources. And we should not be allowing companies to come and strip mine us of that, and we don't have a window on those sorts of things. So if you think Canadians have a valuable perspective, then we need to have ways to share that with the world. And we have to recognize that we are, from a people's perspective, small, and that in order to have our voice heard, and I say this again from my perspective, when you are a small community and you want your voice to be heard, you have to press levers and take moves where your voice breaks through. And that should be what Canada should be seeking to do, while we hold pressures that threaten those things, while the government holds those at bay. I think Canadians should, and Canadians have struggled with this in my lifetime, is respecting yourselves and the value that you bring and the things that you create. They're as good and as valuable as anything that has an American stamp on it. And we should celebrate that much more often than we do. And I'm not saying in a nationalist way, I'm just saying we are also humans on this ball floating through Earth, and we have the same value. And maybe, in fact, to end, I would say, maybe our values are what the world needs in this moment. Because if we want that culture, we can also see where that culture is going. And I would hope Canadians, certainly I know Anishinaabe, see that and go, yeah, we're not that interested in that. This is why we want to tell other stories.
Yeah. I'll tell you this, Q. Last week, I saw Paul Simon, and Paul Simon opened his set with America. And he told the story about how, this is a song about two kids who set off looking for the America that they've been promised as they grew up. And then Paul Simon sort of ends the story with, like, I seem to have found it here in Canada. And there was applause to this. And I was like, boy, I think I'm a little bit troubled by some of that, because no, Paul, these seem to be actually kind of distinctly Canadian values that maybe are eroded where you are currently living. But there was like this big sort of round of applause for that. And I understand where that sentiment comes from. But let me tell you the story. I was talking to a journalist who was telling me the story about how during the uproar of negotiating NAFTA and how intense that negotiation was, there was all kinds of like, hey, we have to protect all these different Canadian industries. And at the end of the day, they ended up being a part of NAFTA. So they opened up, for competition for trading with the United States. And one of the questions that journalists were posing at the time was like, hey, is Canadian culture going to be for sale as a part of NAFTA? And repeatedly they were told Canadian culture is not for sale. And then they'll go, well, are Canadian culture production businesses for sale then? Or like, are they available to also be taken over? And then they were like, well, yeah, that's a different thing. Like the idea of like culture as a business, that's a different thing. And I sort of like, I'm looking at this and I'm seeing the same thing play out, 37 odd years later. There's something interesting to me about the recurring echoes of history here. Do you think Canadian culture has been for sale for some time, Q? Or are we doing okay kind of protecting ourselves, do you think?
I think we're doing okay protecting ourselves, but I think also like I'm okay selling my wares to the world. Are they paying? Like I'm happy to spread some Canadian culture around the world and get some dollars in my pocket. Like
yes.
For me, when I look at it like that, I feel like, yes, we're making content. And one of the ways production companies and creatives, and one of the ways we make money doing Canadian TV is by selling it internationally, because, we got like 40 million of us here. There's, I don't know, 8 billion other people that might want to see Schitt's Creek. Let's find some other people to. So I don't want Canadian culture to be adjusted by outside, by people to tell us what our Canadian culture is. Like we're here. We know what our Canadian culture is. It's different with everybody. Everyone's got their own definition of it. And I think that's all well and good. And when we put that on screen or on wax or on, I don't know, whatever an MP3 is, whatever we put it on, and we send it out to the world, I think, yeah, let's do that. And let's share. Cause we're pretty good at a lot of things. And so why not share that stuff with the world?
I'm going to go have just a quick round of recommendation from each of you about a place where we should get our Canadian content right now. Jesse, I'll start with you. Where should we go to get our Canadian content right now?
Well, I mean, I can only say one. Well, then I would say I'll name the streaming service that I think most Canadians should belong to, but probably don't, which is APTN Lumi. I think is a great streaming service that we have. Has lots of great shows on there. Is the lower T is free, I believe, and then if you want to pay, I think it's like 5 or 6. Like it's not at all expensive compared to the large multinationals, and there's great stuff on there.
Q, same question to you. Where are you going for your Canadian content right now?
Oh, there's lots of places, guys. There's lots of places. I would say if I have to choose one to get a bunch of stuff on, I think right now there's a lot of interesting stuff on Crave. I mean, you can see my show on Crave. Yes. 8 lovely episodes for you to watch. Yep. But there's also like a lot of cool stuff that they just released, like Late Bloomer season 2 came out, and I think you can get Children Ruin Everything on there as well. I think there's a lot of cool stuff that's on there right now. That's great Canadian content that is also selling very well internationally.
I swear to God, I'm not mentioning it just because I work here, but you should get CBC Gem, because CBC Gem has North of North, which became the most watched thing on that streaming platform since its launch. That show is incredible, but also there's just so much else for you to watch on CBC Gem. Vass, last word to you, pal. What do you got?
Physical places, live concerts, buying the merch, lower the markup.
You want me to go to a
independent bookstores? Let's go. Message me. Get an extra ticket. Sneak me in. Yeah. See you guys there. But don't tune out. Enjoy and support Canadian culture. But the second war of trade war is war, and that's a very serious word. And yes, everything is up for grabs. The digital sales tax, the digital streaming tax, culture, supply management, all these things that kind of we laugh or scoff at. These are serious conversations that we need to support Canadian politicians on defending Canada.
Peak Vassandra right there. I
just
know what happens at the end of that story.
Stratford.
Yes, 100%.
I just watched
truly
Crow's Nest. Yeah, let's go.
Crow's Nest, Soul Pepper, Obsidian. We'll just say all the theaters.
Just do it.
I really appreciate it, because that was just, you guys are just naming Canadian theater companies. That's great. I love this for all of us.
Well, They were like, there's so many. And I was like, can you tell me some more? Because I was like nervous what my answer would be.
And then you named so many
Like,
different
there's
places.
100. I'm like, oh no.
I mean, I think like the takeaway is be conscious, right? Like be conscious of the stuff that you're consuming and be deliberate about going to a place where Canadian culture is being made. I got to leave it there, you guys, but I really appreciate your time. You guys are the best. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Jesse Wente is currently a storyteller in residence at Toronto Metropolitan University. And while he was not speaking to us in his official capacity today, he's also the chair of the Canada Council for the Arts. Vass Bednar is a policy expert at McMaster. She's also in Toronto. Anthony Q. Farrell is a screenwriter and showrunner. He was at those CRTC hearings, making his case for the Writers Guild of Canada. Fun fact about the CRTC, the R does not stand for radio. It stands for radio television. But T stands for telecommunications. Who knew? My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This show is called Commotion. We'll be back tomorrow. I'd love to see you then.